To show you a photo, just one, because sometimes one photo is all it takes to get to the heart, as it were, of the issue. This was the famous photo, for instance, that showed a young girl running terrified down a street in Vietnam that galvanised Middle America against that war. And who can forget this photo of the dead boy on the beach several years ago that led to the throwing open of Europe's doors to millions of refugees? The reason these photos are so powerful, of course, is because they trigger an emotional rather than a rational response, which is why the media and the left-wing propagandists love them. So much easier to tug at the heartstrings than to offer up fact, reason and logic. Currently, a war is raging in Israel, and here is the photo that tells you everything you need to know about the history and the future of this conflict. This is what is called the Iron Dome at work in the skies above Israel. On the right-hand side of the photo, you can see the deadly rockets being fired out of Gaza in an aggressive and deliberately offensive act of war, designed to kill and maim as many innocent, everyday Israeli citizens as possible. Those rockets, by the way, have been supplied by Iran, funded in part by the Obama-Biden administration, and indeed by countries such as ours via our donations to the United Nations. Now, on the left-hand side of the photo, looking like something out of Star Wars or Close Encounters, you can see the Iron Dome, a technological miracle that allows Israel to shoot those Iranian and Hamas rockets out of the sky in a purely defensive act designed to save citizens' lives. Now, allow that to tug on the logical side of your brain rather than tug at the emotional strings of your heart. On the right-hand side, a barrage of deadly missiles supplied by the terrorist Iranian regime to the murderous thugs of Hamas, designed to kill Jewish men, women and children as they sleep in their beds. On the left-hand side, a highly sophisticated and remarkable defensive system designed through ingenuity and necessity over many long years to protect lives. That is the story of the Gaza conflict and the history of Israel and Palestine. Pretty much everything else you will hear is obfuscation, distortion and lies, including this insidious rubbish that the Palestinians are the victims courtesy of the pernicious moral relativism of the left, peddled incessantly by the mainstream media and spouted by fools such as the creepy former leader of Pink Floyd, Roger Waters.
Unless some pressure is brought to bear upon the Israeli government to stop their ferocious, murderous attack on Gaza.
What rubbish. Of course, this disgraceful performance by Adam Bolton on Sky News in London, interviewing the Israeli ambassador, Tzipi Hotovely, takes the
United Nations, its duty to say that Hamas is committing a double war crimes. Right. One war crime is they're shooting from civilian areas, and the other one they're shooting to civilians. So they're committing double war crimes.
As you well know, the United Nations has repeatedly said that the settlements are illegal in international law and should cease, and those are continuing.
But they need to condemn terror organization, which is recognized by Britain and by the United States, that is now shooting into civilian
all
population.
I'm saying, it's a bit rich to say the United Nations should do something when Israel is ignoring what the United Nations has said in the context of settlements.
Can I ask you something? What would you do if Britain was under a fire? What would you do if London was under fire and rockets were thrown on your house? What would you do? Do you think Britain would have sit in silent, not protecting its citizens? Do you expect any sovereign country not to protect its citizens?
Of course you can protect citizens. The question is the retaliation and the attacking of civilians in Gaza and elsewhere, which, as we know, once again is leading to disproportionate suffering on the Palestinian side.
Disproportionate, settlements. So just to be clear, in the eyes of the woke left, Israel should sit back silently and allow its citizens to be blown to smithereens by rockets and bombs because of complicated historical reasons. There are some disputed Jewish settlements out in Judea and Samaria on land that, by the way, for over 3,500 years has been the home of the Jews. That's your lefty logic. Oh, and if Hamas fires thousands of deadly rockets into the suburbs of Tel Aviv, if imams call for Israeli Muslims to rush out and buy cheap 5-shekel knives to slit the throats of their Jewish neighbours alongside whom they have lived peacefully for decades, as they have done, if synagogues are burnt to the ground, oh, that's all hunky-dory. But it is disproportionate. What a vile word, disproportionate of Israel to defend its people. How dare the Israeli government stop Jews being killed? Well, may Adam Bolton hang his head in shame.
I showed you last week on this program and in Kenny on Media how the ABC's been misreporting and misrepresenting events in the Middle East. Incredibly, they've portrayed Israel as the aggressor, telling audiences that Hamas rocket attacks have occurred in retaliation for Israeli bombings. Here are a couple of examples from the ABC.
A series of explosions lit up the night in northern Gaza, signalling airstrikes by the Israeli military. In response, the militant group Hamas has fired hundreds of rockets at Israeli cities.
In retaliation, Hamas and other militant groups fired hundreds of rockets into Israel.
Yeah, poor Hamas and those other militants having to fire back and retaliate against the onslaught from Israel. Astonishing, isn't it? And to be frank, it's typical of the media coverage you get of this issue in this country. The media is dominated by the Green Left, and this is one of those emblematic issues, as you know, where they attack Israel and instinctively take what they see as the pro-Palestinian line. Now, you only had to see this station today to see that the Palestinian line gets very, very good coverage, and you would have seen plenty of pro-Palestinian opinions on this station today from former Foreign Minister Bob Carr, from a man who was the ambassador of what he calls the State of Palestine, which doesn't actually exist yet, and also from this representative of the Australian Palestinian community.
Israel's a nuclear-armed state. You know, there is no parity when you talk about a conflict. I'm no fan of Hamas, but I really, really don't like Israel and its heavy-handed military operations.
There you go, the full gamut of opinions on this station, but that sort of moral equivalence is odious, isn't it? Israel is big and he doesn't like Israel, so this justifies rockets attacks fired at civilian targets in Israel, deliberately killing innocent people. It's just not on this sort of stuff, but it's typical of the attitudes reflected in our media, which, whether by design or not, can only give succour to the terrorists, because the violence such as we're seeing now is not really about Palestinians versus Israel. It's Hamas terrorists versus Israel. Hamas targets civilians indiscriminately. Israel tries to target Hamas ruthlessly. It's a horror, to be sure, but there's no moral equivalence. The civilians of Gaza, like the civilians in Israel, are often the innocent victims in all of this. Yet, incredibly, journalists in Australia, with the encouragement of the Journalists' Union, are signing up to an open letter complaining about the coverage of these issues. Not because of this anti-Israel bias, but because they don't think it's sufficiently pro-Palestinian in this country. Now, this letter even cites the destruction of the media building in Gaza, where Israel warned all the occupants to get out. No one was hurt when it targeted the building because it says Hamas military intelligence operations were based there. So this new open letter cites the bombing of this building as evidence that Israel is targeting journalists. Seriously? Anyway, the journalist letter claims that there is a growing dissatisfaction here and elsewhere with the media's treatment of what they call Palestine. It goes on to call for more coverage of the Palestinian perspective and says we should respect the rights of journalists to express personal solidarity with the Palestinian cause without penalty in their professional lives. This is extraordinary. Apparently dozens of journalists have signed this in Australia, no doubt many from the ABC. So journalists who give us anti-Israel bias in their reporting are now looking to get more support for their anti-Israel campaigning, and they even demand immunity from criticism for their bias. They reckon they ought to be able to campaign against Israel instead of being objective journalists, but be free from any sanction professionally over this. It's just more proof that the Journalists' Union is a big part of the problem in this era of fake news. Let's catch up with the Director of Policy at the Institute of Public Affairs, Gideon Rosner. Gideon, I know you keep an eye on this stuff, but this is extraordinary. You know, journalists are actually wanting to campaign for a pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel angle on all of this, but not be called out for it.
Well, there are two parts to that, Chris. Firstly, the journalists want to campaign. Now, that's not the definition of journalism as I understand it. Journalism should be about reporting objective fact, not pushing a barrow or an agenda for a particular side, including people who, by the way, want to use our tax dollars, as you said, on the ABC, to effectively advocate for the actions of a listed terrorist organisation. But the other point to be made, that's the obvious one that you articulated very well, is the media is too biased towards Israel. Since when? I've been following the media when it comes to issues about Israel my entire life, and it has always been very, very pro-Palestinian, and it's getting worse. How often do you hear, Chris, on news bulletins that the evictions in a part of Jerusalem that set this all off were effectively squatters who refused to pay rent? How often do you hear about things like the fact that Israel will call up a building before it bombs it and warn the occupants to get out? I mean, no other country in the world sends out a save-the-date card for a military occupation, for military exercise, but that's exactly what Israel does in the name of being humane, and they're the oppressors and the occupiers. It is an absolute joke.
Yeah, it is extraordinary because this media coverage, as you say, uses all these old tricks, and it's about a body count and it's about one person's military might versus the other. They portray it as Palestinians versus Israel rather than what it actually is, and that is Hamas and other terrorist groups attacking Israeli citizens. And shockingly, on both sides of the border, between the Palestinian territories and Israel, innocents are getting killed. That is shocking. But one side is trying to minimise the casualties on the civilian side. The other is trying to maximise them.
That's right, and it's not as if we shouldn't feel deeply sorry and sympathise with the Palestinian people. I sympathise with the Palestinian people, but the source of their anguish and their suffering is not the state of Israel. It is their corrupt, murderous leadership that has kept them languishing in refugee camps for 70 years instead of building a homeland for them, and is using them as human shields to use the deaths of their own people effectively as a propaganda device. The Palestinian Authority, or the Hamas, I should say, is deliberately doing this so as to get a media reaction like the ones we're seeing in this country, and the left-wing media in Australia and elsewhere falling for a hook, line and sinker.
What does it say about the Journalists' Union, though, when they're circulating this open letter? They support this point of view. They just don't care about this bias. They encourage it.
They encourage it. It shows a few things. It shows that, for one thing, that they're bad journalists, so they can't actually research the facts. All of what I've told you could be revealed by a quick Google search. It could be revealed by talking to Palestinian people who've actually left the Palestinian territories because of persecution, for example. And that's another point that has to be made. It's funny to see all these left-wing journalists who support, LGBT agendas and all sorts of other things. In fact, they say on Twitter there can be no queer liberation without Palestinian liberation. Well, go to Ramallah or Gaza City and see how far being, an openly LGBT person gets you in those places. There's only one place in the Middle East where gay people are accepted unquestionably and have full legal rights, and that's the state of Israel.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, Gideon. I appreciate it.
Cheers, Chris.
Bit of clarity with the facts there from Gideon Rosner. It is shocking. It's a shocking situation. We all want a peaceful resolution, but we've got to deal in facts.
What is happening in Gaza? Who's to blame, and what lies ahead?
Well, before I tell you that, I can also confirm we've had some very, very poisonous demonstrations here in London today, including Israeli flags being burnt by so-called Palestinian supporters. But the reality of the situation in Israel and in Gaza is that a few days ago, the Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the terrorist forces that control Gaza, launched an intense bombardment of rockets at Israeli civilian population. And they've so far, in the last 3 or 4 days, they've fired over 2,000 rockets at the Israeli civilians. Most of them, I'm happy to say, have been taken down by the Israelis' Iron Dome missile defense system. Some have got through, and unfortunately, some Israelis have been killed. Cities like Tel Aviv and Jerusalem itself and other places throughout parts of Israel have been hit by these missiles. Meanwhile, of course, the IDF have been striking back very, very hard, and with precise strikes to take down the Hamas military infrastructure, doing their best, of course, to avoid killing innocent civilians. There have been many civilians killed in Gaza, but that's inevitable when you're dealing with a terrorist organization that hides behind human shields and makes that the central focus of its military strategy, to try and get Israel to kill their own civilians. I think the reality right now, there's some consideration being given to peace negotiations mediated by the Egyptians, which could, I think, possibly produce some kind of result in the next day or so. But Israel has certainly done devastating damage to Hamas's military infrastructure without a shadow of a doubt, including a really brilliant operation that occurred on Thursday evening in Gaza and destroyed kilometres of their tunnels.
Rita.
Well, tell us about that, because that was quite a strategic move where they tricked Hamas into reacting a certain way, and they used the media to achieve that. Take us through that.
It was an incredible operation. In my long and not so august military career, I don't think I've ever known of such an extraordinary surprise attack triggered by deception, a very, very deliberate deception operation. And effectively what the Israelis did is that they massed tanks, artillery and infantry on the border with Gaza and gave every indication they were going in. The tank engines were noisy, there was dust being kicked up. The world media picked that up, and Hamas, of course, picked it up as well. And it was then thought there was going to be an immediate invasion of Gaza. And of course, hundreds of Hamas terrorists then went into this, what's called a metro tunnel network, an underground tunnel network they've dug since 2014, which contains weapons, contains command and control facilities and shelter for the terrorists. They went down into there, and immediately they were inside. The IDF then attacked those tunnels with 160 aircraft, which dropped JDAM bunker buster bombs and destroyed large parts of the tunnels. And then when some of the terrorists came out, they then got hit as well from the air. So it was I think, as you said, a strategic victory really for Israel, which will probably prove to be a turning point in this conflict and really hit Hamas with an absolute body blow.
Caleb.
If you listen to some people who keep saying that the response from Israel is not proportionate, they make it sound like, there are a couple of blokes in their sheds having a few beers in Palestine, just, building some rocks and missiles in their backyard and then firing them off and they don't go anywhere. Is that the reality? Who is actually backing Palestine to be able to attack Israel like this, and is the response proportionate?
Well, the first point I make is that Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad are funded and equipped by Iran. They are basically an Iranian proxy, and they are carrying out this action at the behest of Iran. They obviously want to do it themselves as well, but Iran is behind it, pulling the strings. And it is Iranian-supplied missiles and material to make missiles inside Gaza that have enabled Hamas to launch this overwhelming bombardment against Israel. And the answer to the other question about proportionality, the idea, I've seen this with my own eyes many times. I've been in command posts, I've discussed with IDF commanders, I've observed on the ground the extreme care that the IDF take to target terrorist leaders, to target weapons, to target ammunition, and to target command posts, but not, if they can possibly avoid it, to hit civilians. Now, the way Hamas work, they have all of their main locations surrounded by civilians or occupied by civilians, with the deliberate intention of trying to get Israel to kill their civilians. Israel's very careful. They make phone calls to people in apartment blocks that also contain Hamas facilities, warning them to get out, and telling them where to go to be safe before they bombard it. And if they don't leave, then they've developed a low-powered munition that can be dropped onto the building to give a very loud warning, but doesn't destroy it, to people to get out. And only then, when they're confident that majority of civilians have gone, will they then carry out a strike? And we've seen, for example, several high-rise buildings totally destroyed by Israeli air power. And I think in all those high-rise buildings, I've not heard of a single civilian casualty being reported, which is an extraordinary accomplishment. And I've said before, and I'll say again, that no other army in history has taken so much care and been so effective in preventing civilian casualties on the battlefield as the IDF. And I include in that my own, the British Army, the Australian Army, all of whom take immense pains to avoid killing civilians. But the Israelis have, I think, have very much got the edge on this.
Amazing. Rita.
You mentioned the Iranian regime and their part in this conflict. What part has the Biden administration played, if any, in emboldening the Iranian regime? Is it a coincidence that we had a number of peace deals in the Middle East under Trump, and now 4 months into the Biden administration, and we've got a terrible conflict, the likes of which we haven't seen in many years?
Well, we haven't seen anything like this under the Trump administration. We saw several operations of this type by Hamas before, and we've seen this one after. I don't think that's coincidental. I think they knew that Trump was extremely strong in his support for Israel. They knew he was unpredictable. They didn't, I don't think, dare to launch an attack of this sort. Biden, on the other hand, has sent all the wrong signals, and I think the Biden administration's policies must take some share of the responsibility for this attack happening. Of course, responsibility is with Hamas, with Palestinian Islamic Jihad, but America has a huge role to play. And if America shows any weakness, and America has strongly sided with Iran, America has essentially, under Biden, has done its utmost to abandon one of the most important US allies in the region, Saudi Arabia. US has signaled its intention to unconditionally leave Afghanistan. Now, that's not connected, but of course, people see these signals and they react accordingly. And I think Hamas has reacted as a result of that to some extent anyway.